We have a lot of football to do with Schlereth, so I did want to spend a little time on the big NBA trade from this week with Siakam going to the Pacers from Toronto. So Toronto doing a full reset here after the OG deal, criticism after letting Van Vliet walk, and now Siakam on the move, which is still a few weeks ahead of the trade deadline. It's not normal operating procedure for GMs where you just kind of feel like the longer you wait. But Siakam has been floated around for such a long time. Even OG, where apparently they did turn down multiple first-round picks for OG and then like the player combo with Barrett and Quickly Better, which I don't blame them for. And so now we're kind of looking at Toronto. I was like, all right, what's the next step? Because let's just face it, coming into this year, this is a really disappointing team. It's not as disappointing as, Atlanta's up there for disappointment. The Lakers are up there. Golden State's up there. But Toronto's probably on a short list of 5 teams. So when I saw the trade when it was first announced, I was like, all right, so the Pacers are moving Bruce Bowen, Jordan Nwora, and 3 first-round picks. And I think I've been the James Cook of just going, dude, these first-round picks are kind of overrated. Like, what's the big deal? But then you have to look at the protections. You have to understand, like, what the risk could be and then what it is down the road. As far as the pick for this year, if you look at the Pacers and where they're at in the standings with the nice win last night against Sacramento, that pick is 19th. All right. This is also considered a very terrible draft, especially like an all-time terrible draft, especially at the top. That will change. Will be in May, and people start telling you how much they like the draft. But this has been a draft that 2 years out, I've heard people going like, man, 24 is going to be bad. All right, so the first-round pick of their own, that's 19th. The first-round pick of the worst of either Utah, Houston, LA, or OKC. And that's OKC as of right now. So that'd be the 27th pick. So you're looking at 19 and 27 this year. The one that is a little scary is the 26th first-round pick from the Pacers going to Toronto that's top 4 protected. Now, it's very simple to say, hey, with Halliburton, they re-signed Siakam. Mathurin takes another step. Maybe one of the other younger players plays well. Who knows? Like, you don't have to worry about that thing, being the 5th or 6th pick. That seems likely today. But we don't know that, because the funny thing about this draft surplus, as we've seen in recent years, just everybody trading as many picks as they can for some of these players, that there's going to be one transaction we'll look back years later and go, oh my God, I can't believe what they gave up. And then it's going to feel like there's an identical transaction just based on the number of picks involved, where we'll look back on that one going, dude, they gave up nothing. Like, one of the first ended up carrying over to becoming a second. They got a pick at 21 and 28 and the other one, so it'll be weird because we still don't have like the final price tally on a lot of these transactions that were just a big part of this boom for everybody going like, look, let's just keep moving all of our first rounders. So when I first saw it, like, my first thing was, okay, but if you're going to move that, even if you're talking about 2 picks in this year's draft, thinking what we think of it today and the 26 top 4 protected, like, you better know you're keeping Siakam. Like, that can't be a rental for a team that probably still isn't getting through with Siakam, getting through the top teams that are in the East. Who knows? Could be, but I don't know that all of a sudden the Pacers defense is going to be enough that it's going to make them competitive with a Boston, a Milwaukee, a Philadelphia. Milwaukee's one of the strangest teams ever. Like, you look up 2 seed, really good record, keep winning games, and then there'll just be this blip every 4 or 5 games where defensively you're like, what is wrong with those guys? So when I didn't have any information on Siakam's intention, I was a little more worried about it for the Pacers. But the feeling, especially if you're going by what Woj has been saying, the phrasing specifically about what Siakam's interest is in staying this summer and staying with the Pacers, and then me digging around a little bit where it's like they had to have known that Siakam was cool with staying in Indiana, which, isn't going to be for everybody. And it's nothing against the Pacers. There's probably more than half the teams in the league where you go, I don't know that that's ever going to be a destination. And I'd put the Pacers in that group as well, even with Halliburton's massive step that he's taken this season. So if Siakam's cool with it, instead of wanting to be kind of wined and dined and being looked at one of the top free agents with this offseason class, which I've got to get into here for a second too. Like, if Siakam's cool with it, they already kind of know. It seems like the Pacers are smart enough. They're going to move that kind of stuff. Whatever you think of the picks, you'd have to have some assurance that you're good to go with Siakam in some kind of an extension, that he doesn't want to be courted by everybody, or he doesn't want to go somewhere else. It gives him a better chance to win. Then I like the deal for the Pacers. And here's why. It gets back to the Danny Ainge rule. The Ainge rule, it's not necessarily he that invented it, but it was the first time it was explained to me years and years ago, like 15 years ago when I was still in Boston. And I talked to Ainge, and I was like, as a younger guy, and depending on who I was influenced by and the different NBA writers or the different people I would talk to, I just kept always thinking like, oh wow, this team will have this cap space, and oh, you can't do that deal because it's going to get in the way of their cap space, cap space, cap space, cap space. And Ainge is like, you guys overrate cap space so much. Like, it's a joke. Like, go back historically on how many players are actually moving. Like, it's a cool plan to sell to your fans while you're not losing games. But then all of a sudden you got to use that cap space and you're bidding against everybody else. And if you have that much cap space, it means your team probably isn't even that good. So who's actually going to show up that's going to alter the course of who your franchise is? Like, I remember Orlando resetting the decks and thinking they were getting Duncan. They ended up with Grant Hill. That was like this thing at the time. I'm like, God, they're so smart. And then since that time, in the last 20 years, you're going, oh, a lot of teams do that and they end up being burnt, and then they have to spend their money on somebody they didn't even want to. So if you're looking at the free agent class, and some of these websites need to work on their top free agent list, like, you just shouldn't be putting the restricted free agent, like Tyrese Maxey is the number one free agent because he's restricted. So it should be the real free agents. If you're looking at the real free agents, OG and Anunoby, well, they probably have some understanding for them to move that many pieces to pay for that trade in OG in New York. So, again, I don't know how realistic it is that he's a real free agent. Paul George with the Clippers, okay, maybe. I mean, that becomes another thing too when you look at some of these players that have the player options where, if you had cap space and you were banking it for this offseason and you're being told by the agent, like, okay, my guy's opting out, and then he doesn't opt out or he ends up getting an extension. Like, there's just so much unknown. And the Ainge rule was always, I would rather use cap space, or at least ruin my own cap space, and ruin's the wrong word, but I'd rather just make a transaction where I know with 100% certainty of who I'm getting. And in this case, that's exactly what the Pacers did. Like, Siakam, believe it or not, once you sift through kind of the nonsense of some of these free agent lists that are out there, you could argue Siakam might have been like the number one, just free and clear, anyone can bid on him free agent this offseason. That sounds crazy as I said it out loud just now. And even when I wrote it down earlier this morning, I'm like, is he really the number one guy? And you're like, realistically obtainable? Maybe. I like Siakam. I probably should like him more than I do. And that's what it is. It's a like. 1 year in doing the all NBA voting. I've had it 2 years. I think there was a year where I was like, is he 15 or 16? I may have put Jimmy Butler over him. I'd have to go back and look at it again. But I was like, man, we're talking about somebody who like is going to get third team votes here. Like, why don't you like him more? There's definitely a fall off in the playoffs. I think he becomes a little bit predictable and maybe easier to guard. I don't know that there's a ton of spacing with him, but him at 29, 30 in April, and considering what else is available for a Pacers organization that is not a destination, and the fact that you're adding him to Halliburton, who looks like he's going to be a real star in this league, so you're showing that you're committed to this. Like, it makes a lot of sense for the Pacers to go, hey, Siakam's probably better than anybody that we can use our cap space on. So let's just go ahead and do that. If we get the assurance that he wants to stay, and two of these picks might not even matter, and if we're good, the 2026 pick might not be that big of a deal. It's kind of a home run for the Pacers. There's also something else that I wanted to bring up, because one of the other rules that I think about is like the Vooch rule. And the Vooch rule is this: if you're the Bulls, and those picks ended up being far more disastrous than I think anything we project for the Pacers if this goes wrong. But the Bulls make a deal, and at the time I'm like, well, at least they're just trying to figure out a way to compete. They were right on the DeRozan thing. The Levine issue is what it is. They were right on Caruso. It sucks about Lonzo Ball. But you're like, man, that starting five, like, Patrick Williams, you get what I'm saying. Like, if you're a Bulls fan, you're kind of playing along going, best case scenario and all these different things. But what did the Vooch contract, or I should say it this way, what did the Vooch acquisition guarantee you if you were the Bulls paying that kind of premium price? Did it guarantee you another round in the playoffs? Because it felt like at least guaranteed that you were competitive now in the East, but not the elite tier. But it didn't really guarantee anything. And based on what the team hasn't done in the playoffs, it's probably below even expectations. So if you look at the Pacers and you go, well, if you add Siakam, what does it guarantee? Does it guarantee you an Eastern Conference Finals? No. Does it guarantee you the second round? Is it still a no? Like, well, let's see what he looks like once he's there. Cleveland continues. When you look at the standings, you're like, Cleveland's still the 4 seed? Like, how are they doing this without Garland and Mobley? And they just keep beating teams. It's incredible. But I think a lot of fans would have to be reminded that Cleveland was even a 4 seed here. So maybe it guarantees you the second round, but guarantee is probably the wrong word here. More likely to get to the second round, that's fine. But the counter to the Siakam transaction is, okay, but what is your ceiling? And I think it's fair, but it's irrelevant in the bigger scope of what you're discussing here. If you're a front office going, hey, we're adding a guy in here that we're likely not going to be able to get elsewhere. And if we want to wait around and keep waiting around, then we're going to have to do what we just did, and that's spend cap space on Bruce Brown, who's a nice player. And when the reports first came out about what Bruce Brown's deal was, it was 2 years, $45 million. We found out very quickly that the second year was a club option. So it's like, is he really going to get the $45 million from whoever has his rights? Is he really going to get that kind of money? But it was kind of that big number. Let's use the cap space, shorter deal. But Bruce Brown, sans Jokic, is not somebody that I'm super interested in investing in. I mean, there's a lot of players that with Jokic, I'd be like, I don't know that I want to pay him the Jokic stat prices. Jabari Parker got a deal 5 years ago, over 5 years ago, where he got 1 year, $20 million with a club option on the second year. But that was another one of those, let's pay a big number on the shorter deal, allow us flexibility. They ended up trading him later that year anyway. Here's another little added element to all of this as I talk about free agency and cap space, because now the players aren't doing shorter deals for the most part. They're just going to do their contract. They're going to max it out as much as they can. And if they want to ask out, they'll ask out. That's going to change a bit just based on what their options are and where they can go with the new, basically a hard cap at the top of this for the most expensive teams. But if you're looking through teams that, look, Houston at one point was thought to be a destination. NBA players really like Houston. Nobody would take their cap space. Now, it wasn't a very good team. I shouldn't say nobody's going to take it because two players clearly did, but they weren't getting a primo guy this year. So they pay Van Vliet 3 years, $129 million. Third year's a team option. Brooks gets $86 million, 4 years, fully guaranteed. So when the numbers come out, you're like, man, those are massive numbers for Dylan Brooks and Fred Van Vliet. And that's part of the Pacers discussion. Is it's like, well, you can get Siakam now and pay the price of draft picks, but if you re-sign him, like, wouldn't you rather give him the 40 plus million than not have any idea and then be stuck with the cap space and being like, who's left? Like, all right, I don't know. Do you want to give that guy 1 year and $28 million because we don't really like him, but we have to use the space? When you look at Charlotte, right? They spent 4 years, $120 million on Gordon Hayward. It technically ended up being a sign and trade, but that was about him having the leverage to be able to do it. The injury thing alone, 168 games to the Hornets, clearly wasn't worth it. But the Hornets had to pay Hayward because they were the Hornets. And that's a staggering number. The Mavs, when they broke up the 2011 team, people were upset about it, and they played the result because they didn't get back, and their whole offseason plan and cap space didn't really work out. I didn't really have that big of an issue with that team being broken up, but it's easy to say it was a huge mistake years removed. But they were, once again, the Mavs feel like they've done this a lot under Cuban. Clear the decks, set up for cap space, let's figure it out. They ended up with Monte Ellis for $25 million. Denver, a couple years ago, well, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they brought in Paul Millsap. He was 32 years old, $90 million over 3 years. And I mean, look, Millsap was okay, but he wasn't prime Millsap. But it was another place in Denver where, it was look, it's for the most part, it's been a really good organization, but it's not been a destination for anybody. And they had cap space. They wanted to add to what they had. They paid $90 million to Paul Millsap. Detroit had a deal where Josh Smith got $54 million over 4 years. Look, they paid Ben Gordon and Villanueva huge money prior to that too, when they kind of try to figure it out on the fly. Josh was waived in the second season. They paid him until 2020 with a stretch provision. Memphis in the cap spike year of 2016, they spent $94 million on Chandler Parsons, who played 95 games. I saw a thing from 2 years ago as I was researching this, because I was looking at like the non-destination teams and the cap spending that they've had. And look, there's some teams that have clearly hit it, but it's such a flawed plan, and it's an almost impossible plan for about 2/3 of the franchises in this league. There was an Oklahoma City piece up from August of 21 that ranked the Thunder's top 5 free agent signings. I don't know if this is wrong or if I'm missing something because I can't remember every single transaction for every team over the last 20 years. But number 5 was Caron Butler. Number 4 was Patrick Patterson. Number 3 was Nenad Krisic. 2 was Derek Fisher. Number 1 was Nerlens Noel. Like, wait, Micic might have a chance after this year to crack that top 5. That is the point. The price, the headline of 3 firsts sounds bad. The 2 firsts this year probably aren't going to be anything you're worried about. There's some exposure in 26 if things just went bad. Then you couldn't say predictably bad, but you never know. Like Atlanta probably didn't think those picks were going to be as high as they're going to be when they did the DeJounte Murray transaction. But if you're one of those teams, and I think the smarter teams, they go, I just would rather pull something off now than waiting around and hoping to predict all these things that become really tough to predict. So if they re-sign him, home run for the Pacers.